Popular sovereignty meant that the sovereign people of a territory should determine the status of slavery. It was popular with politicians because it was a comfortable compromise between the abolitionists and slaveholders. Democrats elected General Lewis Cass, a veteran of the War of 1812, as their candidate for the presidency. Cass supported slavery. The Whigs chose Zachary Taylor as their candidate. Taylor did not have an official stance on slavery, but he did own slaves. Henry Clay was not chosen because he had too many enemies. Eventually, the Free Soil Party emerged, formed by anti-slavery men of the North. They supported the Wilmot Proviso, they were against slavery, they were for federal aid for internal improvements, and they were for government homestead. Zachary Taylor won the election of 1848, helped by the Free Soil Party, which diverted votes from the Democrats. In 1848, gold was discovered in California. There was a huge influx of people, and it brought much violence and disease that the small government in California could not handle. In response, they drafted their own constitution which excluded slavery and applied to Congress for admission into the Union. The Southerners objected to California's admission because it would upset the balance of free and slave states. The status of the South in the 1850s was as follows. They had a majority of the leadership, including a majority of the cabinet and in the Supreme Court. Their cotton industry was expanding rapidly, which led to more profits. There was also no threat of abolition, as they could veto any amendment easily with their majority of power. The Underground Railroad was a chain of abolitionists' homes on the way to Canada that helped slaves escape from their former masters. This is a map that shows various routes that slaves took. Southerners demanded a new fugitive slave law, of which they rested their argument on the Constitution which protected slavery. The congressional debate of 1850 was called to talk about the admission of California to the Union and threats of secession by Southerners. The immortal trio spoke. Henry Clay suggested that the North enable a stricter fugitive slave law. John Calhoun proposed to leave slavery alone, return runaway slaves, give the South its rights as a minority, and restore the political balance. He wanted two presidents to be elected, one from the South and one from the North, to yield the same power. Daniel Webster proposed that compromises should be made with the South and that a new fugitive slave law should be formed. William Seward, a senator and abolitionist from New York, argued that God's moral law was higher than the Constitution. President Taylor was influenced by this and vetoed any compromise between the North and South that went through Congress. After President Taylor died unexpectedly in 1850, Vice President Millard Fillmore took the presidency. He signed a series of compromises which brought upon a second era of good feelings. Talk of secession subsided, and Northerners and Southerners were determined that the compromise would end the issue of slavery. In the Compromise of 1850, California was admitted as a free state, and New Mexico and Utah were open to slavery via popular sovereignty. Thus, the Senate was unbalanced in favor of the North. The Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 stated that fleeing slaves could not testify on their own behalf, were denied a trial by jury, and Northerners who aided them in escaping were subject to fines and jail time. For the election of 1852, the Democrats chose Franklin Pierce as their candidate. He supported the Compromise of 1850 and the Fugitive Slave Law. The Whigs chose Winfield Scott, a war hero from the Mexican War, as their candidate. He praised the Compromise of 1850 and the Fugitive Slave Law as well. Votes were split among the Whigs, with the Northern ones hating the party's platform but accepting the candidate, and the Southern ones supporting the platform but not the candidate. Franklin Pierce won the election of 1852 handedly, of which marked the end of the Whig Party. It died on the issue of the Fugitive Slave Law. The victory of the Mexican War stimulated Manifest Destiny, resulting in Americans looking to the islands of the Caribbean for possible canal routes, especially Cuba. William Walker established himself as president of Nicaragua in 1856. He legalized slavery, but was eventually overthrown by surrounding Central American countries and killed in 1860. Nicaragua was the world's leading marine and commercial power. The British feared that the Americans would monopolize the trade there and secured a foothold in Greytown. The Clayton-Bulwer Treaty stated that neither America nor Britain could exclusively control any waterway between two bodies of water, in this case the Caribbean Sea and Pacific Ocean. Cuba was seen by Southerners as very desirable slave territory, resulting in President Polk offering $100 million to buy it from Spain, but getting rejected. In 1850 to 51, two expeditions of Southern men descended upon Cuba with hopes of taking it over. In 1854, Spanish officials in Cuba seized the Black Warrior, an American ship. This meant it was time for President Pierce to provoke war with Spain and take Cuba. The Ostend Manifesto, mainly created by Pierre Sol, stated that if Spain did not allow America to buy Cuba for $120 million, then America would attack Cuba on grounds that Spain's continued ownership of Cuba endangered American interests. There were transportation problems to the Pacific, so a transcontinental railroad was proposed. Wherever the end of it was, whether the North or the South, that region would prosper economically. After acquiring California and Oregon, a transcontinental railroad was proposed. James Gadsden bought an area of Mexico from Santa Anna for $10 million and allowed the railroad to run through that. It ran from Houston to California. Stephen A. Douglas proposed the territory of Nebraska to be divided into two territories, Kansas and Nebraska. Slavery status in each would be decided by popular sovereignty. Kansas would most likely be a slave state, while Nebraska would most likely be a free state. This contradicted the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which forbade slavery in the Nebraska Territory altogether. Douglas repealed the Missouri Compromise to allow the Kansas-Nebraska Act to take place. He was named a traitor among Northerners, but was still popular among Democrats. There were many results to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. It helped pave the road to the Civil War. All compromises between the North and the South would be difficult. There were more abolitionists in the North, and there was less respect towards the Compromise of 1850. The Democratic Party was shattered by the Kansas-Nebraska Act, while the Republican Party was formed in the Midwest. It included Whigs, Democrats, Free Soilers, Know-Nothings, and other foes of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Southerners hated the Republican Party.